Cero.
Hola a todos.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a true pleasure to welcome you again to our Wealth Talk, which is one of our exclusive talks for Santander Private Banking. And what we're trying to do for the last 2 years is to offer you the opinion and analysis of experts in different fields and to one extent or the other, they can offer some impact in markets, the economy, and in investment strategies. Today, we're going to speak in Spanish, but you can follow it in English if you push the EN button, which is on your screen.
In English, you can do so by pressing the button that says EN in the upper right corner screen of your screen. También podéis lanzarnos vuestras.
You can also ask questions or comments using the tool. In the top part of the screen, you will see where you can add questions and comments. And finally, just to say that today we have with us Carlos Duarte, who is one of the most prestigious marine biologists in the world. And he's going to talk with Victor Mataranz, who is the director of the Santander Group, and he's also responsible globally for the private banking. Thank you very much, Cristina. Hi, everyone. Well, I hadn't been connecting with you for a while now, and here we are this afternoon, and I think this is a session that should be really, really interesting. As Christine said, today we have Carlos Duarte with us, who is a Spaniard based in Saudi Arabia. He's a marine biologist and a world leader in the regeneration of the oceans. And at a time when sustainability and climate change are almost always addressed through a very, should we say, defeatist prism. So we wanted to bring you closer to a constructive and hopeful view of one of the best scientists in the world. Carlos, it's a true pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon.
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much, and thank you for asking me to join you. I'm delighted.
Well, for those of you who don't know him, Carlos has got a degree in marine biology, a PhD in limnology, studied at the McGill University in Canada. He's been a professor at several international universities, and currently he is working at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia, and he holds the Tariq Ahmed Huapet Research Chair in the Red Sea Ecology. Apart from that, he is a professor at Aarhus University in Denmark, associate professor at the University of Western Australia. He has led expeditions to the Arctic. He's written over 900 articles, 3 books. Well, I'm going to stop here because otherwise I will be reading so much that we'll take all our time up just explaining all his achievements. Carlos, your CV is impressive and your prestigious is amazing. But I understand that things weren't easy for you when you started. Can you tell us about, we always talk about the experience of Spanish who managed to get international fame, and this is your case. But how do you go from a Spanish university to this such an interesting career? Was it because of the need or just by chance, or did you just go out and try and discover the world? So what took you to this career? So you can just talk a little bit about how you started?
Well, yes. Let's see. I'm not going to go back that far back in time. That would take me way too long. But let me just talk about the milestone that you've described when you said that I had been working in the Spanish system. I was, in fact, a researcher at the CSIC in Madrid, which is Spain's largest public research institute. I was with the CSIC since '89 and until 2020. The final 6 years, I actually was employed by them, but I wasn't teaching them. Now, why did I leap from Spain to Australia? Well, because I was a little bit frustrated by the red tape, the bureaucracy, the difficulties that I ran into in order to research in Spain. Basically, I devoted my working hours to fighting with the administration so that I could actually access the funds that had been granted to me, not necessarily Spanish funds, by the way, European Union funds, competitively achieved. And I found that there were all kinds of inexplicable obstacles. So my research actually was something that I did at night and over the weekends. This actually went on for years. Initially, there was a little bit of progress in our R&D, but over the past 5 years, as I say, the final 5 years before I decided to move elsewhere, I came to understand that the system was not actually standing still, it was rolling backwards. And at that point in time, as a scientist, I felt that I had the wherewithal, with what I had learned, to generate solutions to tangible problems that affected not only Spain, but all of mankind. I'm talking about the ocean. I'm talking about, for instance, seeking sustainable foodstuffs or solutions to climate change, the possibility of recovering the abundant marine life that we've lost over time. And I didn't want for that potential that I felt I could contribute just sort of wither away in this ongoing struggle with the administration.
Well, that's obvious. So what made you go to, where you are now?
Well, I went from the CSIC in Spain. I was studying at the Mediterranean Institute in the island of Majorca in Spain. And, well, basically, every year I was asked by other entities to join them, and I decided to accept a fascinating project from the university in Western Australia. And I went with my wife, who is also a researcher. Both of us were offered a position. I was asked to launch a research institute that would focus specifically on solutions to mankind's problems from the vantage point of the oceans. And at that point, what I established is the largest marine research center in the Southern Hemisphere. However, I also saw that my work there, which was interesting, my work there actually dragged me away from my research activities, because establishing that institute, that was a complex consortium. That was 5 different institutions, and I realized that I was basically devoting my days to meetings with architects and with lawyers in order to draft the right agreements that would have to be signed by the institutions and the industrial sector, and it was my colleagues who actually were the researchers. So I understood that every month I had to return to Europe, because I was the only Spanish member at that point of the European Council, which the government and the European Union had built on. And from Perth in Australia, which is where I was working, Perth anywhere in the world is over 30 hours flight. And now that is a carbon footprint. And also, very difficult. That's right. So everything I scrubbed, I immediately polluted again. So this coming and going would have me flying over the peninsula, the Arabic peninsula, Qatar, Dubai, and I was invited to speak in a university in Saudi Arabia, which was founded 12 years ago now. This was a very different project from anything that exists. The King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which is where I am currently at work. This is a university which is independent, which is international in its scope, which has the infrastructure, the support that you need for research, which is outstanding. And I said, 5 hours from Europe is better. And that way I will be able to continue to carry out my scientific research. I have frankly been very, very productive. It's been very satisfactory when I think about my contribution to problem solving.
Well, that's obvious. Well, talking a little bit about the actual subject at hand, when we talk about the climate change, when we talk about oceans, we always think about them as if they're victims. We see these images of the large blocks of ice is falling into the sea, or the rubbish that is dumped. But I think that you talk about it from the solutions aspect. To what extent the oceans are part of the solution. So to what extent is that true, and to what extent have we already, should we say, destroyed the oceans, or have we still got time to, improve the situation?
I'd have to say that from the point of view of climate change, oceans really are the best possible mechanism to regulate the planet. And 90% of that excess heat retained in the biosphere because of greenhouse gases is stored in the oceans. If there were no ocean, we would now be frying. It would be incompatible with human life on the planet. So yes, it absorbs, it accumulates heat, and it has furthermore absorbed approximately 30% of carbon dioxide, which we've been issuing since the Industrial Revolution. So without the oceans, without that absorption of greenhouse gases, the temperatures would be much, much higher than they are now. So their role is essential, it's clear, it's known, and it is very important that we take it into account for all of the models that run forecasts. Without the ocean, those models would simply not run. And furthermore, this role as a buffer, if you will, as a buffer of the effect of human activity on climate is also triggering major problems, as you have pointed out before. Ice is melting, definitely, destroying the ecosystem that many species depend on, which are associated to ice, marine ice, and which furthermore is substituting a mirror effect. It's turning into a darker object. The Arctic Ocean, without ice, it absorbs heat. So 25% of all of the excess heat in the biosphere, well, this is not due to greenhouse gases. No, it's due to the fact that we are losing that ice cover. So it is an accelerator of climate change, which is very important and which has to be taken very much into account. And another pressing problem that is associated to climate change is the increase in sea levels and the damages suffered by infrastructure, housing, lives lost, human lives lost on the coast are also a consequence of increasingly hot oceans and loss of ice, which jointly are raising sea levels and resulting in, well, beaches that are lost, coastlines that are blurred, and the loss of infrastructure. I repeat, the insurance universe is concerned about this. Apart from those changes, when we talk about how the ocean actually functions, there are other ecosystems which are very vulnerable in the ocean. We see there are major impacts and possibly some that are associated to ice. The ones that are most worrisome are the tropical coral reefs, where we know, well, we've lost already 2/3 of the reefs, not because of climate change, but rather due to direct human activity. So you have pollution, you have the physical damages to the reefs, you have overfishing, you have other impacts. And now, at this point in time, we face a very important problem because those corals will need to survive. In a best case scenario, that would be the most ambitious objective of the Paris Accord. That would be to contain, to limit the rising temperatures 1.5 degrees if you compare with pre-industrial values, and we forecast that we would lose between 75 and 90% of the coral reefs that currently survive in our oceans. Now, this is not a forecast that we should just accept. So what we've done is we have created, the G20 established under the Saudi presidency, a platform which is called CORDAM, which is a global platform for the acceleration of R&D for the conservation of and restoration of coral reefs. So we're working on this new generation of science and technology, which will, of course, allow us to defend and conserve these ecosystems and even tackling climate change.
And Carlos, you have got the concept of blue carbon and all the strategy behind it, obviously. And what does this exactly consist of? How does it affect what you call the natural blue capital?
Well, let me backtrack to your previous question, because I'd like to add a little bit to that. When you think about the ocean, we think about the ocean as a victim, but the ocean can very well be a solution, at least a partial solution to climate change. The most robust, of course, of these alternatives is blue carbon. When we look at what the results have been of human activities on carbon, there are two main components. One of them is greenhouse gas effects, which is the result of fossil fuels and the production of cement, and the other is the losses of that coal, which are the result of the loss in the ecosystem. So excessive forestry for farming purposes. So we would have to see that these are changes in the use we make of the land. But that is not a well-designed name, because that change, those ecosystems are also subject to alterations which have resulted from activities in the ocean. So it's not only the land that is being used differently, there's also marine ecosystems that are being destroyed. And along the shores, which limits the border between oceans and continents, are these ecosystems, the blue carbon ecosystems, which are as efficient as the most sumps. We'd have to think about submarine activities, and we'd have to think about the way we would take advantage of the activities, 50% more than the capacity of forests. This had not been taken into account so far to date in the fight against climate change. If we think about research, I'm sorry, I don't know whether you're touching your microphone. I'm sorry, the audio is not coming through well. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry about that. I had my hand on the microphone. Yes, so we were talking about marshlands and so on, and we were talking about activities between the 1990s and the year 2000. We came to understand that the role of these ecosystems as sumps is important, and these ecosystems were furthermore subject to higher rates of destruction of the biosphere, 2.5–3% per year, and that is 5 times the rate of the losses in rainforests. In the year 2009, a number of agencies from the UN reached out to me because they had been following my research activities, and they asked that I work with them to draft a report which was presented in Copenhagen. And that research, which I had carried out, which identified these ecosystems as the more important marine carbon sinks or sumps, was actually focused on in order to launch the strategies that would be necessary to avoid future losses of these ecosystems, and furthermore, to restore and recover what we had lost. So we saw that there was a way to react, and this was called blue carbon, the role of marine ecosystems as marine carbon sinks. And all of this concept of blue carbon actually stems from this report, which, as I say, dates back to 2009, and now is a line of research, a very active one. The family of, or the group of actions that generate advantages, oceans-wise, continues to grow, and the possibility of working with the ocean, working on the ocean, generating benefits, recovering the natural blue capital of oceans in order to obtain our objectives has grown by approximately 15% or even more, because there's a very interesting seaweed which is called Asparagopsis. This is a seaweed which has proven to be able to be eaten by cattle, cows, sheep, by grazing mammals. 90% of methane will be reduced. Now, these methane results of grazing animals are responsible for a very high percentage of greenhouse gases. So with a small amount of seaweed every day, you resolve 80% of the problem inherent to climate change.
Well, let's see what we talk about with this seaweed and human beings. But anyway, so it's not just an issue about taking into account the seaweed or the algae in the marl to absorb the gases, but also you have a special application that you apply it to cattle and it reduces the emissions. Wow. Well, a question. What do I have to do, for example? We're really used to saying, well, I'm going to plant, seeds and trees, and I'm going to invest in the trees, and they absorb CO2. But what really do you think? So what are you doing? You're going to get you look after areas with all this algae and seaweed, or what are you actually doing to favour the fact we have more of these sort of species?
That's an excellent question, because so far these actions were not onboarded into other actions. So new legislation in place in Spain includes, for instance, actions that would affect the coastline. And the same can be said for other countries that are also including these kinds of actions within their set of actions designed to tackle climate change. So, for instance, today, right before this conversation, I was working on developing projects that would be interesting for private investors who might want to achieve objectives that are geared to carbon neutrality and who need these instruments. So let's bear in mind that we have to think about the mangroves. When we talk about mangroves, well, we have lost two-thirds of them. And mangroves capture carbon and are a very, very efficient line of defense with regards to the threats of cyclones and rising sea levels. At this point in time, the most ambitious project, which aims at regrowing mangroves, is taking place in Bangladesh, where the world's largest mangrove exists. They share it with Pakistan. This is a mangrove which we know exists. I think that all of us, all of the listeners, remember The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. Well, the forest is the Sundarbans mangrove. That is the mangrove that is shared by Bangladesh and Pakistan. That is the jungle. This is where Shere Khan lives, the royal tiger, the Bengal tiger, the bad guy. Shere Khan, that's right. That's a mangrove. Now, recovering that mangrove, recovering what we've lost, is a very, very important objective. And I think at this point in time,
So the tiger had a different name. We're talking about the panther now.
Yes, the tiger is Shere Khan, yes. So at this point, the investment in mangroves is very important in order to obtain these credits. If you compare with forests, for instance, because one of the differentiating elements of blue carbon and green carbon, those are the actions that look at reforestry to avoid the loss of mild climate forests or rainforests. Well, there are no fires in the sea. And we've seen how over the past few years, we've seen how there have been devastating fires in Australia, in California, also in the Amazon, and in Siberia even. Many of these forests that have been burnt down had been planted with the objective of defending the climate. Now, if you sequester it in the ocean, you can't burn it, right? Because there's no fires in the sea. So this investment in blue carbon is even more attractive, together with those additional benefits, not only protecting our shores, but also contributing to recover our fishery stocks, because many of the species actually survive in mangrove or in marshlands. And those advantages are much more than the climate benefits that derive or emanate from carbon. Now, you've talked about seaweed. The only element at this point in time, the only action that can lead to advantages are those that are associated with sequestration with seaweed, because these forests of seaweed do sequester carbon, but they do so at a great distance from the forest, where the verification of those advantages is actually very difficult.
Well, apart from that, there's not a lot of carbon then, because we produce it in some more highly populated areas. Well, I'm not quite sure.
Well, something which is interesting about these advantages or benefits is where are they generated. Apart from that, well, it doesn't really matter whether that carbon is sequestered in the hills around Madrid or in Chile, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you are removing the carbon.
Well, that's obviously one question. Well, here with our private banking customers, and you've talked about the thing of investors who want to use this to buy carbon credits, etc. To what extent are you seeing that there is an investment interest, an important one? You know, investment funds, are they investing them? I know one fund that invests in all these, ocean issues. To what extent is it happening?
Well, let me give you a little bit of information, which I think is very telling. Usually, when projects are launched, that happens at the summit, right? The COP. Remember Glasgow, COP26? This year it's going to be 27 in Egypt, in the Red Sea. So if we go backwards in time, remember Paris? That was 15. That is when we signed the agreement back in 2015, right? The very famous Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement. Those blue carbon projects, when a project was announced, an investment, when it was announced, we were talking about approximately 1 million euros, right? Approximately. Now, 2 or 3 years ago, investments were to the tune of tens of millions. And in Glasgow, we talked about billions. So I think that this speaks for how important, attractive the investments are in blue carbon. And actually, the fact that this is attractive is a problem for me, because every year and every month and every week, I have requests for interviews and conferences and video conferences from all kinds of wealth management funds who want to learn more about this field. And many of them are not really interested in the value of carbon. So we heard in Glasgow an announcement about the largest reforestation project for mangroves in Bangladesh. This was launched last year, as I say, in Glasgow. And it is Combex, a British insurance company, footing this bill. We were talking about carbon neutrality as the objective, but because it is an insurance company, protecting the shoreline, the coast, in order to ensure that infrastructure and real estate and so on was defended in those areas that are protected, fit in beautifully with their business model. So Alliance is also very interested in blue carbon, not because of the carbon necessarily, but because they're going to have to cover fewer claims. And then another advantage is rebuilding the natural blue capital, in other words, biodiversity. And what the advantages are: protection of coastlines, carbon are add-ons. They're added values, but they are not really the essential reason why the investment is going to be carried out. So you have different investors with different priorities, but they all agree that investing in these ecosystems is a good idea, an investment which will generate a tremendous series of benefits and which will be effective from the point of view of returns on investment.
How interesting. Yes, we're seeing a lot of movement along those lines, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more in the future because it's something that's obviously very clear from funds and the impact it's going to have. Well, Carlos, I would now like to talk about Oceans 2050, this foundation that you have created together with Alexandra Cousteau, Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter. And I think the objective is to regenerate life in the oceans, is that right? So what prompted you to create the foundation, and what sort of projects are you currently working on?
Well, let's see. I'm going to make a reference to something which we didn't really cover in our conversation before. Remember, we talked about pessimism regarding the current condition of oceans. We talked about the future of oceans. I think that pessimism is something which paralyzes us and doesn't really reflect the real situation that oceans are in. And if we were talking about this but 20 years back, I would have very few reasons to be optimistic, when talking about the future of oceans 20 years ago. But now it's 2022, and we know that there has been a series of developments which have radically overturned my perception of what the future holds for oceans. I began to change my approach some 10 years ago. You have to be a careful observer because good news usually doesn't make headlines. So your careful observer began to read news about successful measures in the ocean, which began to be visible in different parts of the planet, and they seem to be isolated, one-off cases, but you begin to see what is actually happening. You begin to see minor victories on land and in the world to ensure that oceans were kept safe. Well, it wasn't just one-offs, it was a tidal wave of recovery. And I think that this tidal wave is going to allow us to change the status quo of oceans, and we're going to be all that much more positive. When I began to read these news, which seemed to be independent, one from the other, when I began to look for the source of these good news, I began to understand that something was happening in the ocean, which truly changed our future outlook. I published an article in Nature, which is the most important magazine in 2020, together with a series of collaborators. And this article was called Rebuilding Marine Life. And what we did was we provided scientific proof of the fact that, yes, it is possible to recover life in the oceans. We've lost approximately 1/2 of our natural blue capital. And of course, we know that our welfare depends on this, solutions to our current and future problems. But this loss is not irreversible. It is possible to recover some of what's been lost. So I thought it was very important to change the ethical approach when we deal with the ocean. Ethics that was based on conservation, you go back to the 1990s, try to not lose track of what we have. And remember that we were aiming for an objective, which meant that every year we would not be successful in avoiding the kinds of losses that we were suffering year after year after year. So what we need to do now is not conserve the little that is left. We need to recover the very much that has been lost. So in that article, we concluded that yes, it is possible to recover abundant life in our oceans within a generation. In other words, by 2050. Alexandra Cousteau, who was very concerned, very worried about the ocean, she thought, what are my children going to see? Very different, the ocean that she knew and loved when she was with her grandfather, Jacques Cousteau. Well, this was a source of inspiration, and we decided jointly to establish an organization, Oceans 2050, the objective of which is this specifically: rebuild, regenerate life in our oceans so that by 2050, our children, our grandchildren will enjoy a healthy ocean. a healthy ocean that will continue to be a healthy ocean for future generations. This is very important. It's important not only because we prove that it's doable, but because it is an ethical mandate. We have the opportunity to regenerate life in our oceans in the upcoming 30 years. But if we don't begin within the coming 10 years, that window of opportunity will shut fast, and we will be denying future generations the possibility of enjoying an ocean which is full of life, an ocean which will provide backing to a quality of life that can be defined as acceptable and reasonable for human beings now and into the future. So this is basically our objective, our roadmap in this article. That's Oceans 2050, to achieve the objective. It's a very straightforward way. 6 rules. Rule number 1, protect species. We're doing that. So the humpback whale, which is a huge animal, one of the largest animals ever, bigger than dinosaurs, most dinosaurs. Back in 1978, it was limited to some 200 whales alive in the ocean, and everybody was convinced that it was doomed. But there was a moratorium on whale hunting, on whaling. That was agreed in that same year, and the consequence has been that, yes, we have recovered this population, and now we have over 60,000, only 200 just a couple of decades ago. And we believe now that this is an exceptional amount of humpback whales. And we're seeing the same with many other species as well. So protecting species, yes, it does work. But we also have to protect spaces. And now, at this point in time, practically all countries in the world have joined forces seeking one objective, which is that 30% of the ocean be duly protected by 2030. That is the objective that we have baptized 30-30. We're now at 12%, roughly, and I think that we will be achieving 30-30, our objective, and in 1 month's time, there's a UN conference that's been scheduled that will specifically deal with these objectives. The venue will be Lisbon, a conference of oceans. I believe that it's going to be very important because all of these policies are going to be bolstered. The third line of action is to contain and do away with pollution, including plastics. But there are many other alternatives, many other types of pollutants in the oceans. Fourth line of action is to harvest oceans sensibly, sustainably. Slowly but surely, we're making headway so as to ensure that our fishing stocks be managed sustainably, and furthermore, that we actually be in a position to grow these stocks so that they be more productive and that they generate more value in the fishing sector. And our fifth guideline is to contain climate change in the lower margins as set forth by the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 degrees above the temperatures which we had at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now we have 2 or 3 tenths of a degree. That's the leeway we have. But I do believe that we will be successful. I believe we will be successful, but it's going to be difficult. We know that this is going to call for much work and many investments. And then the sixth guideline I did not recommend in my article, but I think it's the most important one of all. And when I'm asked what really counts, what is the major risk that oceans face, sometimes people expect me to say habitat being destroyed or overfishing or extinction of species or climate change. No. The greatest risk for oceans is that we no longer trust in being able to achieve healthy oceans. When we give up on that objective, then it will be impossible to achieve the objective. So optimism based on scientific data, optimism based on scientific facts, This is what should encourage us to be as decisive as possible when thinking about those 5 levers in order to recover our oceans.
Oh.
Wow. That's impressive. It's really well structured, and I'm convinced that you've got really good figures there related to the impacts you've achieved up until now. So really, that makes us feel optimistic. But a person, I don't know, apart from things that you can invest in and to help institutions like your institution that dedicate their time to this, but what is the most important we could do on a daily basis to help you? You know, is it related to plastics, or, you know, what would you say, for example, if that from our daily behavior we can do something, or is there nothing that we can do?
No, I think that there is something which is very important, which is mindset. We have to change our mindset. Think differently. This pessimistic approach vis-a-vis the future, well, we've seen that society believed in it. Society was convinced. And you have Greta Thunberg, for instance. It is a dramatic approach to the future that awaits. This very negative vision of the future that awaits our children, our grandchildren. Well, it's been definitely reinforced by the pandemic, which has had us in lockdown, which has made it impossible for us to lead our lives normally. This terrible pandemic that has had so many victims, our relatives, our friends, which has had us stop working, which has had us, well, in lockdown. This is a very negative perception of the future. We were beginning to celebrate because we believed it was the end of the pandemic. There was a 5-minute break, and we ran into something else, which is the war in the Ukraine. I think that our mindset, our current mindset, is not one that would be optimistic, frankly. And I think that this is something that is reflected in investments and that what market reactions. The market reacts to what society does and feels. And right now, well, we're in the midst of a crisis. It's all very gloomy. We need to do something about that. And as Joan Baez said, and I'm giving away my age here, as Joan Baez said, back in the 70s, Joan Baez said that action is the remedy against despair. So how to fight? By acting. Acting how? Decisively. And seeing also that there are business opportunities, because if recovering our planet, repairing the planet, if it's going to be philanthropy, and I remember in the UK they talked about 10%, remember? 10% was basically what we could donate as persons who are socially accountable. Well, that's not enough. That's not enough to solve the problem. What we need to do is ensure that our reaction in the face of the climate crisis, to repair damages on the biosphere, to rebuild the planet's climate, is a recovery in economic terms, an activity that generates wealth, that creates jobs, which is productive. And once that focuses on our economy and not part of our philanthropy, only then will we truly be able to recover the patient. And I am convinced that the fourth industrial revolution, we know what the tools are going to be. It's going to be robotization. It's going to be hyperconnectivity, massive use of internet, artificial intelligence, massive use of sensors. We know that those are going to be the tools, but we're not sure what for. And it is the what for which is part and parcel of the fourth industrial revolution. It is repairing the planet, and it should be lucrative. It should be for profit. And they've understood that in Saudi Arabia, which is where I am at work. You might wonder, a scientist who is working to provide solutions to the climate problem, working in Saudi Arabia, isn't that paradoxical? Well, no. business opportunities in the future will be positioning themselves as sources of services and goods within a context of a sustainable planet. So, green hydrogen, for instance, other types of technologies which are going to allow us, for instance, alternatives to plastics, single-use plastics, all of those technologies, all of them are interesting market opportunities. And I think that they are going to be profitable for those who wager on these technologies. And I believe that there are many Spaniards following us this afternoon. I work with someone, an academic, how to solve this problem. This is a person whose name is Ana Aznar. She is the daughter of Jose Maria Aznar, the president of Spain. Ana Aznar, the name rings a bell, of course, but she is a researcher. She works at Windsor in the UK, and her research is a very specific one. Very few persons are working in the psychology of emotions. She teaches about the psychology of climate change, how just by changing the narrative, changing the message, we can actually turn back on those defeatist actions and reactions in the face of those challenges that we face, and turn it into a positive attitude that will encourage us to take whatever measures are necessary and which will empower us in order that we can contribute in a positive way to this positive future that we need no matter what.
Yes. Well, we're talking about the controversy, about the possible contradiction. Well, at the end of the day, everything matters. And so, well, these countries have a lot of resources. So if we can use them for these things, well, it's better to use them for that than for using them for other things. Well, Carlos, just a last question. I've got several questions that we're getting from the public, but one of the parts, that for those who don't know, Carlos is also part of the scientific committee for Extreme E. Extreme E is a rally, electric rally, 4x4, which is sponsored. We actually sponsor one of the Carlos Sanz teams, and it's been going now for 2 years. What has been your experience with this competition? Well, let me ask you a question which is very controversial. So, the environment, is it really the main issues related to this competition, or it's just something like that you're using to adorn this competition, in the nowadays?
Well, let me say that if I were not convinced that it is important, an essential linchpin of Extreme E, I wouldn't be there. I'm committed to that Extreme E board. I invest in Extreme E. Well, I don't know. I'm not a shareholder. I don't invest economically, but I invest as a scientist.
Well, we sponsor it, but...
Yeah, well, what I mean is, yes, yourselves and ourselves, I think we're just so sure of how important that component has. You see it in Extreme E, so many different angles. And in my case, I know firsthand how important this component of the project is. What initially was very attractive about Extreme E is, well, let me actually say that I'm not really keen on these. I'm not keen on these extreme sports, because burning gas and particles and loud noise just for fun. Sports, it's all about sports. No, but that really goes against my principles. But when I was told, because I remember the first time was in Saudi Arabia, and they reached out to me because they wanted me to help look for projects that truly be important and truly have an impact on climate activities here in Saudi Arabia. And then when they told me, no, we want to use e-cars. We want to prove that rallies off-piste is possible with current technology. We want to encourage electric, sustainable mobility with renewable sources of energy. And furthermore, we want to contribute by being there with our partners, Santander among them, to deploy projects that will mitigate the effect of climate change wherever the races are held, raise awareness about how important it is to be decisive in the face of climate change. And then another component, which I think is also very important, I'm talking here about equal rights. This is initially very interesting because it's the same platform, it's the same rules, it's the same score for men and for women. And I thought, this is really interesting. Men and women are, in fact, on an equal footing here. So generating a relationship with wonderful champions such as Carlos Sainz or Laia Sanz, the pilots on your team, I should, of course, not be saying this, but since it's just you and me and we're under the rose, it's my favorite team, Santander, my favorite team. I really have seen that we mesh because they want to be heroes, of course, which they are. I mean, Carlos Sainz, he's a legend, but they furthermore want for their skill in reaching out to the population actually have a purpose with a capital P. We talk about climate, we talk about options, about climate change, we talk about oceans, and that empowers them. These conversations empower them, and they can reach out to their followers, massive audiences. And furthermore, you have different audiences. You have broadcast, you have streaming, you have 1.5 billion people following these activities. When I reach out as a scientist to the population with my messages that I want to share about what it is we can do in order to have a good effect on oceans or on climate, I reach out to maybe thousands. I never have millions, and of course I wouldn't even dream about a billion or 1.5 billion. So these audiences, these persons who follow sports, well, they're eclectic. We have fans who hold different positions, who have different opinions. They think differently about politics, climate, biodiversity. But those messages, if it's me, fine. But if it's their heroes, if it's great athletes, they pay attention to their heroes. And at the end of the day, we engage an audience that is outside of our bubble, the bubble where our followers live. So Extreme E and sports in general, as a platform for communications purposes, definitely offers a fantastic added value to whatever I can achieve as a scientist.
Está claro.
Well, it's obvious, and I think that's the real value behind all this. It's a multiplier effect. It fits in line with what you've said earlier. That's very clear. Well, we're running out of time. I think we've just got time for one question from the audience. I've received lots of really, really interesting questions, but there's one here. I'm not sure to what extent it's in your field, but I'm sure you can answer it. They're saying is, when will we have a sustainable system for desalination? Using seawater, of course. Can you answer that?
It's actually very important. Just this morning, I was at a meeting, and this is what we talked about. Saudi Arabia is the largest exporter of oil in the planet. Not the most important consumer, but the most important consumer is the U.S. But Saudi Arabia is the most important country where desalting happens. So if you think about energy consumption in households, 1/3 goes to desalting. Actually, without this desalinization entities, the country would not have developed because 95% of water that is used is desalted. So finding a sustainable desalting model in Saudi Arabia is absolutely of the essence. It's important for the world. And actually, JFK, President Kennedy, back in the 60s, said that if science could find a way to turn salt water into drinking water, that would be the most important scientific contribution to society. We've got that in Spain, in the Balearic Islands, where I have a family home. we desalt because that is the only way. The island has only been able to continue to grow and progress as a tourist attraction because there are not enough sources of water. It's got to be salt water that is desalted. So sustainable desalting exists, and it exists from the point of view of energy. There are two models, and the source of energy for desalting purposes has to be a renewable source, so solar or wind or even the energy that comes from the ocean. In Australia, we developed a desalting program that actually fed out of waves. That exists. And in my university, we have a desalting plant, which is very robust, and it supplies a high percentage of drinking water for the university and for the 8,000 persons who live around the university, on the campus and around it. It's based on the heat which is generated by the air refrigeration systems, the air conditioning. So the source of energy is done. And then you have the impact of the return of the brackwater that returns to the ocean once the water's been desalted. We have not really advanced very much. We shouldn't have a problem because what we're returning to the ocean is what it was in the ocean originally, the salt. The challenge is to return it, but in such a way that it can be diluted so that brackwater be diluted in the water. But even in the reuse, well, there's other concepts which would allow for the extraction of lithium, gold, and other valuable minerals. And at this point in time, there's research taking place, the possibility of using it in such a way as to ensure that there is a reduction in the return of this brackwater to the oceans. We are thinking about zero brackwater. So we could be certain that we have achieved a circular and sustainable desalting method. I think that that's around the corner, 5 years.
That is really impressive. That changes the panorama, as you've explained very clearly. Well, Carlos, well, thank you so much. We could be talking here for hours. We could be here all night, in fact, because it's so passionate what you're talking about. And I love this tone that you're giving, making it all sound so positive, because climate change, you always end up thinking, oh, what a disaster it is, and everyone seems to be so pessimistic about it. But I really hope that we have the opportunity to meet again soon. You know, maybe related to Extreme or any other occasion, or maybe another one of these talks. Or if you ever come here to Madrid, well, come and visit us whenever you can.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been very interesting, a true pleasure. Any platform, your platform, where we can talk about the future of oceans, where we can talk about climate, where we can actually do away a little bit with that very negative approach. I'm not an optimist. I'm realistic, actually. And I have to say that I'm in the front line of what it is that's happening. And what is happening, I have to say, is a solid foundation for optimism looking forward. But it's going to call for hard work. There are business opportunities. Investments will be very, very interesting.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And to everyone else, thank you very much for connecting today. I'd like to remind you that we have lots of these wealth talks. And this will soon be up on our website, on our privatebanking.com. And we'll soon offering you another one. I really hope you've enjoyed this. And good afternoon to everybody. Thank you.